Hey everyone, welcome to the Voices in Japan podcast. On today's show, we are joined by Drew Richard, author of the book Every Human Intention. He's an American writer, journalist, and literary translator. From 2011 to 2016, he covered Japan's African community for the Japan Times, mainly befriending and following Nigerians in Tokyo. So on the show, he talks about the people he met, their way of life working in Tokyo's nightlife industry, their struggles with a hostile immigration system, and much, much more. It's a fascinating conversation that provides a deeper understanding of this very unique community in Japan. Enjoy the show.
1、2、3
Just to get started, kind of interested to hear your background with Japan, like how you made it over to Japan, and also how you started working for the Japan Times as an interviewer. Could you just kind of give us a little background about yourself?
Yeah, so this would have been 2010. I came to Japan at the end of the year, so just a few months before the earthquake in 2011, and I came over initially to study Japanese literature with Uribe Hideo, or Hideo Levy, who is the first Western writer, so culturally or ethnically Western. He's American, or grew up in America anyway, and is ethnically and culturally Jewish, I guess, and who had written and won prizes for literary novels in the Japanese language. And pretty quickly after I came over and enrolled in his seminar, I started writing for a few different magazines and newspapers in Tokyo. And I wound up doing a story about the Nigerian community, primarily in Tokyo, but across Japan. I became curious about people I was meeting in Tokyo from that part of the world and got to know some of the political or civic groups that they had organized among themselves. And that piece wound up getting published in fact, I think it was commissioned by initially. So it was requested by the Japan Times, and I wrote it. And it drove a lot of web traffic. And the editor who had run it for the Japan Times, it was the editor for the community section at that time. And for people who don't know, one of the things that made the Japan Times of that era really special, and the paper has changed a little bit lately, but what made it really special at that time was that it had an entire section of the newspaper dedicated to Japan's foreign community and its concerns and the experiences people were having in that community. And when that story about the Nigerian community really started to drive a lot of web traffic, that editor reached back out to me and said, it's probably a glaring omission that we've never dedicated continuous coverage to this community. Would you be open to working with us on an ongoing basis to do that? And there was some discussion around it, and there were some conditions I wanted to place on it. Like, I hope that in the long run, they would be able to empower people from within that community to write about their own experiences. But ultimately, it seemed like an interesting and important thing to do. So I agreed to do it, and I wound up doing it pretty much continuously for about 6 years.
Wow, yeah, 6 years you were kind of into that Nigerian community, so you obviously got quite close to a lot of those members. Because in your book, the first chapter of your book, and you talk about that the main character, I'm guessing the main character's name has been changed.
Yeah, it's most of the names in that part of the book have been changed because such a large percentage of the people I write about have issues with the criminal justice system, or even more commonly issues with immigration status. So, except where noted, most names there are pseudonyms or false names or aliases. But the other parts of the book, most of the names are true names. Yeah, but certainly in that first part of the book, most of the people, including that protagonist or main character or main interview subject, is it's not his true name.
Yeah, how did you get so close into that community? Because, I think a lot of people who do go to Tokyo or visit Roppongi area, there's a lot of Africans or Nigerians there, and I think a lot of people are quite surprised of that and why they are there. I mean, could you share like the reasons why there are so many Africans in that area of Tokyo?
Well, you've guessed the nature of my interest, right? I mean, as a new arrival in Tokyo, I was really surprised by the diversity of faces and experiences I encountered specifically in Japan's red light districts. And it's not like I don't party, like I'm a teetotaler, I don't drink even. But you wind up in those places because those are places where foreigners in particular get together just to socialize. And I was just curious. I wanted to know who I was looking at and what they were doing there and what kind of lives they'd led. And I wound up getting to know people on an informal basis, just as friends, before I started writing about them. In terms of what brings people in those communities to work in nightlife in such high concentrations, most people in the Nigerian community in particular, but you can generalize this to an extent in the West African community and in other immigrant communities as well, came to Japan in the early 90s, initially found work in factories, and then as factory work dried up, as the bubble economy became a more distant memory, and as they found ways to move into other vocations, other ways of earning money, there were a few that became available to them at certain times for certain reasons. And one of them was selling sort of hip hop styled apparel or clothing. So that's why if you go to Takeshita Dori or a couple other places, you're likely to see a lot of faces from all over the world, but including West Africa and Nigeria. And another one was nightlife, running hostess clubs and running regular bars as well, and those kinds of, in the red light districts. So you'll see them there because it's a type of work that they were able to figure out and that they started sharing advice about among themselves. And because those parts of Tokyo are places where you can operate outside the normal confines of, to the extent that it's tough to be an immigrant sometimes, it's a little easier in those places. I mean, it's a really difficult business to be in, and it can be a risky business to be in for a lot of reasons, but it's easier to be foreign, I think, in Roppongi or Kabukicho than it is, in Marunouchi or something.
Yeah, and in reading your book, I think maybe even some people will be surprised that there's actually, surprised and maybe not so surprised as well that there's people making a living in Japan through some of these types of businesses that these guys are involved in. And what is the actual percentage do you think, though, of maybe the Nigerian immigrant community that is involved in some of these trade businesses going on through containers and whatnot that you yourself were embedded in that first part of your book? Is it a very large percentage, or did you happen to just be within a group of people or community that was very much a part of that world?
I think anywhere you go in the world, you're likely to find Igbo Nigerian people and Edo Nigerian people. That is, people from the part of Nigeria that lost the Civil War. And those are the parts of Nigeria that tend to contribute the most immigrants to Japan. And it's, unless you're somewhere like New Zealand, where I lived for 3 years, was based for 3 years, and where it's kind of hard to make the economics of finding goods and shipping them back to Nigeria work. Pretty much everywhere else, you're going to find that people in a variety of immigrant communities, but Igbo people in particular and Nigerian people in particular, like to engage in that kind of business because there is a demand for a wide variety of consumer products in Nigeria that major companies haven't figured out how to get into Nigeria because it's a tough market to break into because it's unpredictable. And so small scale entrepreneurs from Nigeria, wherever they're living in the world, really like to believe in this very optimistic myth about establishing long-term financial stability for themselves by finding the right items to ship back home from the country where they're earning their paycheck, be it Japan or the US or the UK. And Igbo people, because their part of the country lost the Civil War, really feel that they've been disenfranchised from the kinds of white collar careers that you could engage in as an Igbo person before the war. So civil service, for example. And so they've formed a culture of entrepreneurism that's really important for them. And so to the extent that all of these people in Japan who are from this part of Nigeria are always looking for ways to send goods from Japan back to Nigeria and make money off of it, it's a profoundly cultural activity, and it fulfills a really important set of ideas they have about themselves and their own ingenuity as well. And in terms of, you asked about percentage, and I would say it's got to be at least 60% of adult men in that community have tried at least once to send at least one 20-foot container of goods from Japan back to Nigeria.
For me, it would feel very, very risky, obviously, working in that type of business. But I guess you're saying for them, it's a completely different mentality they have about it. How were you able to, were they open to letting you kind of embed with them, or did that take a lot of time as well?
Obviously it takes time. I think the thing people have to remember is that, things change very quickly in terms of the way that we discuss immigration these days. And that's been happening for some time now. So 2010 or 2011, specifically when I started doing this, was a moment when there were much fewer narratives in major media outlets about immigrant communities like these than there are now. So my interest in the community was a little more unusual and novel, and my willingness to make myself available to that community and answer their phone calls when they felt something unjust was happening to them or they were being discriminated against, and follow up and investigate it and put it in the newspaper. That was sort of new, at least in that community at that time. And I think that made things a little bit easier for me. Today, if you go to an immigrant community of this type, not only in Japan, but in really in any, so-called developed country or advanced democracy, I think you would find a larger concentration of reporters or ethnographers or other people coming in from the outside to try to understand what's happening in that community and how that community is relating to the host society, right? To the country where people are living. And so it would be harder today because they sort of include, specifically the Nigerian community in Japan, they're much further along in their thinking about what they want people from outside that community to know about them and say about them. But I think when I was doing it, a significant enough percentage of people in that community were surprised by my interest and my long-term commitment that they simply didn't bother to censor themselves. And so, lots of people would say to me outright, don't take any maltreatment you experience in this community personally. These are all the things we've been through. And, many people are going to be willing to be honest with you about it. So when people just want to be left alone, don't take it personally, or don't worry about it. Overall, we appreciate what you're doing. And, of course, many people did feel that it was really dangerous for that community to have a reporter around for as long as I was around, while, a certain percentage of the members of that community were being so honest and so candid about what they'd been through. But, all in all, it was an earlier moment in the contemporary history of people like me writing about communities like these. And it had happened less often, and people in that community were less cynical about it as a result.
Yeah, your book makes a lot of interesting, it's great commentary in a lot of ways about immigration in Japan. And I can't remember exactly how you put it in one part of the book, but you were kind of saying there's 3 kind of levels to immigration in Japan. At the lower level, you have basically these different systems or frameworks that kind of allow people or have people end up here doing kind of cheaper labor or cheap labor that maybe industries want to take advantage of. And then you have very high-end immigration, something I guess has kind of gotten started more in more recent years where, highly skilled workers can kind of find a very quick path to permanent residency. And then in the middle, I think you were kind of saying that that's basically what tourism is. It's kind of a way of having
just tourists.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about that exactly?
Well, Japan has been pretty good historically or pretty bad morally when we talk about that level of immigration that mostly involves either on purpose or by accident, or in most countries, it's on purpose by accident or by accident on purpose. Winding up with sort of an underclass of people who don't have regularized immigration status and who do tough work that Japanese people don't want to do for cheap. And, we have a lot of analogous examples in the US, like farm labor on the West Coast would be in real trouble if it had to be obtained from American citizens and so forth. So historically, Japan has been pretty aggressive about letting those people in and then kicking them out. And then Japan has been really good until the pandemic at attracting tourism. I mean, we're talking about a country that had pretty modest tourist numbers compared to somewhere like Europe until the triple disaster in 2011. And then, of course, as everything was going horribly wrong at the Fukushima nuclear plants, everybody thought tourism was just over, that it would take a decade or more to come back. And yet, before the pandemic, Japan was like trying to hit 40 million tourists a year, which is an enormous number. The only element of that system that Japan hasn't been very good at is attracting people with a lot of money or very highly skilled workers in the IT sector and so forth. They've been really late to the game in creating visa programs, sort of golden visa programs that would favor people like that.
How would most of these people come over? Would they get in certain visas and working visas, and how long would those visas last? Because like you were saying in your book that a lot of them kind of overstayed and then would disappear out of the system, or around Japan, as in a lot of countries that happens too. Like in England, it happens a lot where people overstay and then they find underground jobs or jobs that pay under the table. But was that a common thing as well in this community that you were involved in?
Yeah, very common to come over on a short-term but legitimately obtained visa, because remember, you can't board your flight if you don't have the visa, and then overstay. And there are a variety of ways to deal with that overstaying issue in the long run. A really common one in this community would be to get married to a Japanese national. But, it's also important to remember that attitudes towards workers who had overstayed their short-term visas and were working without a proper visa status have really changed over time. In the early 90s, when many of these people first overstayed their visas, it was very clear to them through their interactions with the police in the neighborhoods surrounding their workplaces that they weren't to be bothered as long as they were law-abiding and well-behaved and hardworking. But obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, for those of us familiar with the role of just normal police patrols and the behavior of police officers toward immigrants in Japan in the last 15, 10, certainly the last 7 or 8 years, certainly during the Abe administration, you wouldn't want to have an encounter with a police officer in Japan if you didn't have a proper visa at this point. So that has changed dramatically.
And you were saying that a lot of them, or not a lot of them, but some of them find a way by marrying a Japanese person in order to get a spouse visa. And I've met a lot of people that have done that too in Japan, not just Africans, but other nationalities that try to stay in Japan. But did you ever meet any of the spouses that were that were involved in that kind of arrangement? And could you share some of their opinions if you did meet any of those?
Sure. I met, the Nigerian community in Japan has constituted the single longest commitment of time and energy that I've, committed to anything in my adult life, both personally and professionally. The largest group of my friends are from that community. The largest number of my adult memories are in that community. So of course I've met all of their families, their wives, their children. And those marriages, like marriages in any setting, vary tremendously. I mean, some of them were visa marriages to begin with. Some of them were very genuine marriages that had nothing to do with visa pressures. I think something that probably many people who've gotten married in Japan under visa pressure, regardless of their nationality, can relate to is that it's often really difficult to know when you put all of those things in the mix, personal feelings as well as visa pressures, how much of your marriage is the result of visa pressure and how much of it is the result of strong personal feelings and emotional attachment. And as a result of this really heady brew of motivations and considerations, some of those marriages are rock solid and last a long time and are really inspiring to look at because West African culture and Japanese culture on their face don't have a lot in common. And some of them are really tragic and they're hard to look at because if you get to know both sides of that marriage, you come to sympathize with both of those people, and yet they really just weren't ever right for each other and things can go horribly wrong. And the consequences can be fairly serious, especially considering that, like most Western cultures, and even to a greater degree than most Western cultures, I would say, Nigerian culture is really serious about joint custody in the event of divorce. But Japan's not a joint custody system. It's a sole custody system. And it's a sole custody system out of a desire to avoid confusing children about their identities. But, those children grow up and they understand that they're not ethnically 100% Japanese. And those become very tricky discussions when the child has been taken away from the father after divorce and it's become a sole custody situation where they've just grown up with the mother. And that's among the consequences that are pretty frequent in the cases where all these visa pressures and these cultural differences and just the normal stuff of life have made it difficult for some of them to last.
I mean, you were saying it's probably where you've spent obviously most of the time of your adult life as within that community. That one has taken the greatest portion of your time. How did you see that community change? I mean, were there any changes that you saw in that community during the 6 years that you were involved with them within Japan?
I think when I started spending time in that community in 2011, it was probably at the very tail end of the sense that people in that community had that they could maybe stay in Japan for most of the rest of their lives. And the long-term challenges of integrating into such a closed society when you come from a place that very few people in that society come from were beginning to take their toll. And many of the people I met were considering going back to Nigeria. And part of that is just demographic. Certain things happened in Nigeria in the early 90s in terms of the economy collapsing, and certain things happened in Japan such that short-term visas were easier to get. And as a result, there's a real demographic bump in immigration from Nigeria around that time. And you see that most of those immigrants are of a certain age, of that age when people are willing to go abroad to look for work, even if it's pretty difficult physical work. And so many of those, almost universally men, of course, were getting older when I met them and were reaching the age when they would have to make a decision about whether they could integrate in a more or less permanent way in Japan, or whether they needed to face reality and find a way to achieve an exit trajectory and get back to Nigeria. So the way that the community has changed is a larger and larger percentage of those people are either back in Nigeria now or dividing their lives between Japan and Nigeria. And that was reflected by my experience too. I wound up spending less and less time in Japan and more time in Nigeria with these families of people who had gone to Japan and lived there for 10, 20, 30 years.
What was your time in Nigeria like compared to in Japan? Like, could you see if the families or the people that you were with, were they getting on better when they went back to Nigeria? Were they happier, or did they want to go back to Japan?
Of course, it varies. Of course, there are people who have gone back to Nigeria and feel very satisfied with that decision. There are people who have gone back to Nigeria and felt that living in Japan, in a place where personal safety and earning money in a reasonably strong currency is easier, had sort of ruined them for life in Nigeria. But I think the quintessential experience, the one that the largest number of people I knew would articulate, was the experience of being totally caught between the two, because Nigeria is not a place where it's easy to set yourself up to live comfortably, even in a modest sense. And it's not easy to set your family up to live safely and comfortably. Certainly compared to other countries, it's not. And in Japan, earning money in order to do those things is comparatively easier, if only because of the exchange rate. But there are more reasons in addition to that. So what do you do with that? You have, in theory, a permanent residency or some other immigration foothold in a country where the money is comparatively good and your personal safety is pretty much assured every day, and the conditions for pursuing a livelihood are fairly they're fairly well arranged. And then there's another country where you're from and really represents who you are, and it's your native culture, but making a modest livelihood in a stable way in that country is very, very difficult, or can be very, very difficult. I think most people would wind up doing what many of the Nigerian people I knew in Japan are still doing today, which is going back and forth and feeling deeply, deeply conflicted about it, and feeling deeply resentful of the need to go as far as they have gone and spend as many years as they have spent completely outside the context of their home and their culture, just to make what would be for you and I, probably. I mean, I don't know what your finances look like. Mine aren't stupendous, but it wouldn't strike us as a really great living.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they almost have to deal with it just by having kind of a dual lives going on at the same time, one that makes sense in one situation and one that makes sense in another. And it's not exactly the same, but kind of reading about their lifestyle or their stories in Japan that you highlight in your book, it kind of brings to mind also the situation with maybe some Southeast Asian communities that are in Japan and working. Many people know, like, Japan has this framework with some Southeast Asian countries, especially Vietnam, for like technical trainees that come over to Japan and to work for, in their case, it's a set number of years, and they can develop. Well, they're supposed to be able to develop like technical skills that they can then bring back to their home country when they return. But within that framework, obviously, there's a lot of issues, sometimes with workers running away from their jobs. There's a lot of abuse of the workers by Japanese companies that get highlighted in the news, thankfully, more and more now. But it's just kind of strange that there's different communities from different parts of the world that come to Japan and make a living in whatever way is allowed here. And, but it's still, like you were kind of saying, it does, seem to be providing, at least financially, a much better life than they would, be able to make back home. So they kind of start to live this double life, one in Japan and one back home. I don't know how many people in those communities are kind of going back and forth between their home countries, like the Nigerians are. But, I mean, yeah, it's just, your book does a really good job of it kind of explaining the lifestyle of those types of people. And just as someone who's come to Japan in a very different path, it's just, I mean, again, surprising, but not so surprising to read about people that are making a life that way, in Japan or in those communities, especially in Tokyo.
I think it's probably a fairly universal immigrant experience. You know, if you're coming from a country where it's harder to make a living and going to one where it should be easier, to really struggle to maintain a connection to the place that you come from and to be really torn between those places. I think what distinguishes the Nigerian experience in Japan is just, it's a matter of degree. I mean, it's such a dramatic experience for them. Very few cultures have less in common than West African culture and East Asian culture. They've come a very long way. The community is very small, and yet it's extremely visible. I mean, it would be hard to be more visible as a minority than being an African immigrant to Japan. Certainly, for example, there's a large African community in China, especially in Guangzhou, and they have been highly visible at times too. But it's a larger community, and there have also been periods of relative calm about that community in Guangzhou in particular. Whereas in Japan, the Nigerian community it's tiny, but it's super visible. And, even if I hadn't covered it, it had been in the news periodically before, and it was going to be again, and not in particularly flattering ways. So the amount of attention that's dedicated to that community, given its size, I think really speaks to the improbability of finding that community in this country doing these things.
And you're actually spending, I think your profile mentioned that you actually teach at the University of Nigeria, one of its locations. So how much of your time are you spending, I guess now you're in the U.S., between the U.S. and other, well, obviously during the pandemic, everything has probably changed, but so you're spending a considerable amount of time over there in Nigeria as well, still now?
Yeah, what I do at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka is an oral history project. So I've not taught there, although that would be a fascinating experience because, I've taught a little bit in Japan, and I've certainly taught at universities in the US. And I mean, the difference between students always reveals the difference between nationalities and societies in a really fascinating way. But in any event, yeah, I do spend a lot of time in Aba, which is a city that's actually known as the Japan of Africa for a variety of reasons. One of them being that a lot of people go from Aba to Japan. And what I do there is I spend time with politicians and smugglers, and I research the ways in which money gained through smuggling tends to make its way into state level elections in Nigeria. And state level elections in Nigeria, so when you're electing your state senators or your state representatives rather than your federal representatives, tend to be bought outright by the party that's in power at that time. So that's what I do there. And there are a lot of connections to Japan. The place where I tend to be based when I'm in Aba is the traditional, is sort of the kingdom that belongs to a traditional ruler whose son lives in Japan. And, when he's in Nigeria, the son operates the business that he owns there, which is an event center and restaurant and entertainment venue called Roppongi. Literally the first time I met up with him in Aba, he said to me, "I'm going to show you Roppongi in Aba." And I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about, but show me, And so then we rode across the city to the village that he's from, which is directly borders the city. And there it was, this essentially outdoor entertainment venue and sort of like night spot. It's like a nightlife center called Roppongi. People know, people in that part of Nigeria, and it's not the only city where this is true. They know that these guys went to Japan, made money there, and came back and used it to open businesses in Nigeria. But the irony of it, of course, is this guy goes to Aba, which is a huge city. I mean, the metro area surrounding Aba probably has one of the densest and largest urban populations in Africa, period. And he owns a large business there. He owns a nightlife business. In Japan, this is somebody who may approach you on the street and try to get you to do, 1,000 yen all you can drink. Wow. So you can imagine what it's like for him to be torn between those two places because, where he's from, he's important. And where he works, he's on the opposite end of the spectrum of how much influence he has, and that's got to be tricky for him.
So would you say like a lot of the people who come to Japan, their aim or their goal is to go to Japan, make as much money as they can, learn the experience of owning these bars, nightclubs, and then taking them back to Nigeria and then expanding it on a larger scale to make even more money back at home? Is that, would you say that is a big aim for the reason why they do go to Japan?
I think if you were to ask most of my Nigerian friends, acquaintances, sources, interview subjects in Japan, if that narrative were accurate, almost all of them would say yes. And they would say, not only for me, but for everybody. They would say, everybody came here wanting to make some money, go home and open a business there of some type. But what they all found out, or most of them found out pretty quickly, was factory work didn't pay what they thought it would pay. What they had to spend in order to, just have a place to sleep and feed themselves and get around was more than they thought. And it didn't work out that way. If the amount of money they could have earned was in line with their expectations and the expenses were lower, maybe many of them would have been able to follow through on their original plan of just earning enough capital to open a business in Nigeria and going home. But it just wasn't that quick or that convenient.
Yeah, and it seems like in from your book anyway, the main characters, they all seem to have quite a difficult life. Like you said, they're all going back and forth between their two countries. They have two families, children as well, and they're trying to juggle all these things. But do you have any contacts or friends who kind of would not like that, like in the opposite scale? Maybe they had like a very positive experience and are not going through those struggles, and after their time in Japan, or if they're still in Japan and they're completely happy with their lives and not doing what they're doing now, maybe they went on to other careers.
Definitely. Yeah. You can certainly find those people. And you can find people who've gone back to Nigeria successfully and transitioned to living full time in Nigeria and did it a while ago and have nothing but positive feelings about Japan because it enabled them to do it. And some of those people, not a lot, but some, moved back to Nigeria with their Japanese spouses who lived in Nigeria, who lived in Nigeria with them, and in some cases continued to live in Nigeria with them to raise their children. So that does happen. Those people are well known within the Nigerian community because they're sort of the ideal that everybody aspires to. In terms of people staying in Japan who came over as, short-term immigrants looking for factory work, of course it happens. I mean, a lot of it depends on things like acquiring the language, which can be very, very difficult. But it works out for some people. And those people tend to be particularly visible within the community because they often become the leaders of the civic organizations and political groups that have taken shape in the Nigerian community, because they can they have a Japan-facing way of negotiating their community's issues that people really like. So one who's really well known is the former head of the Imo State Union in Japan and head of the Nigerian Union in Japan, Kennedy Fintan Naji, or people call him Naf-Ken. He's a fluent Japanese speaker and very articulate and has a, sort of happy model nuclear family in the way that Japanese people would envision themselves having families. And so, you don't need to ask me whether he's around. He's around. He's very accessible. He talks to the media. And then there are more low-key examples. So I don't know if you guys watch baseball, but Okoye Rui, or Louis Okoye, is the son of somebody who came to Japan in just that way, who came to Japan as a short-term immigrant looking for work, and obviously was able to start a family. And, now his son is a professional baseball player and a well-known one. And I think Rui's father does go back and forth between Nigeria and Japan. But point being, there are many happy nuclear families that result from these decisions to go from Nigeria to Japan. And many of them do stay together. And I am friends with plenty of people like that. It's a very tricky game trying to decide to what extent those kinds of stories are outliers, or, nobody's taking a survey. Nobody's doing quantitative research about what percentage of people who have engaged in this very, very unlikely immigration journey actually are able to make it work in a long-term way. So you just try not to make generalizations about it, and you try not to assume that it's hard on everybody or that it's easy on everybody.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit if we could, because in the remaining time that we have, your book covers that Nigerian community very much in depth. And then you also have another section that covers a depopulation issue going on in Wakanai. I'm kind of familiar with Wakanai because I worked at a company for about 9 years that was in agriculture, and obviously northern Hokkaido is a big agricultural region. But I wanted to touch on briefly the third section of your book that talks about it focuses very much on the situation in Fukushima, and we don't have too much time to talk about it, but could you just mention briefly about how you got involved in that project as well?
In a very, and again, like in the case of the Nigerian community, in an accidental way, I wound up doing my first investigation of a nuclear plant, which was really long-term and in-depth in 2012 and 2013. And my editors at the Japan Times told me it wound up being the longest article they'd ever published in the print edition. But I don't know if that's true. Point being, by the time that I set out to write this book, I'd already done some work on the nuclear industry, and it had been a pretty technical and challenging and long-term story. And I was looking to return to that. And part of what I'd done for that previous story was spend time in Fukui, where there are far more reactors than there are in any other part of the country, and where they're clustered very tightly together. And most of those reactors were candidates for restart after Fukushima. They were not going to be decommissioned. And so there was a question of, what was it going to look like trying to restart nuclear plants after Fukushima? And specifically, what was it going to look like trying to restart nuclear plants that were very close to earthquake faults, as many of the reactors in Fukui are? So I started going back to Fukui, to Tsuruga in particular. And Tsuruga is the largest city in the southern half of Fukui, and all of the reactors are in the southern half. And, as I was spending time there, more and more people were pointing to one nuclear plant in particular, one nuclear reactor in particular, one regulatory process in particular, and saying to me, I don't know what all the newspaper reporters are doing up in Fukushima with the cleanup. That doesn't really matter right now. The future of the nuclear industry is going to be decided in the next couple of years here in Tsuruga at this particular reactor as a result of these particular debates that are happening. And I took a look around, and it didn't look like anybody else was paying attention. And, when you're hoping to write a book that has material in it that will be relevant for at least a few years, that's a kind of circumstance that's very attractive when you have an important story all to yourself, just because it happens to be a story that's happening somewhere that's really far afield from where other reporters are looking.
And man, you go into a lot of great detail about how that industry works, and just a lot of the absurdity, but a lot of the serious issues and topics that they're looking at. And we're kind of running out of time, so we don't have too much time to talk about it, but I did want to let people know about it because it is another very interesting part of your book as well. And just kind of a final comment. I don't even know if it's fair to ask you for a final comment about it, but I mean, do you think Japan is kind of at a place right now where it's figuring out its nuclear industry situation a little bit better, or is it still just as kind of mixed up as it was at certain points that you describe in your book?
Well, it's a real paradox, because I think the willingness of the regulatory agency now to make decisions that could harm the nuclear industry is much, much greater than the willingness of the regulators that were in place before Fukushima. So in that respect, the culture of the regulator has changed, and it's changed in a successful way. But there have been a lot of growing pains in reaching that point. And as a result, they've sort of systematically alienated, and my book goes into this in, totally unnecessary detail, but they've really alienated the experts whose help they need. So that includes experts who are, fairly antagonistic towards the nuclear industry. They've alienated people who would regulate in a tough way, and they've alienated people who would regulate in a lax way. They've alienated people across the spectrum. And as a result, even though they have a more aggressive posture, they just don't have the knowledge or the staff. It's really dire. The top seismic risk official in Japan, who is part of the nuclear regulator, i.e. the guy who has to decide whether a nuclear plant is at risk from an earthquake or a tsunami, he doesn't have any background in that field. So, I use all these different metaphors or analogies to try to put that into context. But imagine if you needed open heart surgery and the only person available was like a really good kidney specialist. How would you feel about that? And that's sort of what you have when somebody who is an expert in metamorphic rocks, as this person is your top seismic safety official. And in this case, this gentleman is a really great scientist. And so what a waste it is, in fact, to put him in a position where he's really not able to understand all of the scientific data that he's being presented with. Certainly there's a better use for him. And certainly there must be some way to undo all of that alienation that's been inflicted upon real seismic risk experts and to bring them back in to the regulatory agency. Because the first person who occupied that job, who occupied it until 2014, was almost certainly the best person in Japan to do it. But because of the way things went while he was in office, by the time he was gone, he'd been just destroyed in the press. And everybody else in his field, when they were contacted about taking his place, just said, "Are you kidding me? No way. I saw what happened to that guy." And that's why you wind up with that is how you wind up with somebody who doesn't have the proper expertise in that job, because he's the only person who is willing to say yes.
And the name of your book is Every Human Intention. Where can the listeners find your book, Drew?
In Japan, probably your best bet is Kinokuniya. My understanding is that there are either copies there now or they're being air freighted there consistently. The Amazon algorithm is not as cooperative, so harder to find on Amazon Japan. But Kinokuniya is a little bit better about stocking it. And if you want to read it in Japanese, it is being translated into Japanese by a major Japanese publisher, and so you have to wait probably between 1 and 2 years. But if you'd like to see it in that way, it'll be there eventually.
Well, that's good, because there's probably a lot of people Japanese people who should become familiar with a lot of the contents of your book, because again, it goes into great detail about that Nigerian community in Tokyo, about the depopulation problem as well that probably Japan or Japanese people are more familiar with, but also about the nuclear industry in the third part of your book. And man, it was a great read. Learned a lot myself from this. And so again, just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And maybe we can go into more detail about the nuclear industry section in that part of your book on a future episode as well.
Sure, I'd love that.
Thanks for joining us, Drew. This episode is brought to you by Barefoot Bar. It's located in downtown Sapporo, walking distance from the subway station. There are a variety of Japanese-made craft bottled beers, a range of whiskeys and basic cocktails, and there are also burgers and pub-style snacks. Friendly English and Japanese speaking staff are also working there. So yeah, if you're in Sapporo, please check out Barefoot Bar and have a look for more information at their Facebook page at Barefoot Bar on Facebook.